So let's talk about carburetor sizing. We did a video a few days ago about our tunnel ram with a pair of 600s on it. And reading through the comments, it made me realize just how much misconception there is about carburetors, size, their function, their place, the hows and the whys. So I figured let's do a video on this. And if you're looking for an exact formula that's going to tell you, give you a mathematical equation on how to pick the right size carburetor for your car, you're not going to get it here. Click away now, because that's not what this is about. The thing with those formulas is that they work on paper. You know, it's a okay guideline. It's a decent guideline on paper. But like a lot of things, what works on paper does not necessarily work in the real world. So, at the risk of being long-winded with all of this, I have to start this with a story, okay? Back in the 70s, I was a teenager, like 16, 17 years old, and my friend Danny had a 340 4-speed Duster. And we were out one night on Highland Boulevard, and we were going stoplight to stoplight. There were a lot of cars out there that night, and it was an okay running car. It was a stock 340 Duster with headers and like glass packs. That was about it. Other than that, it was stock. And it ran okay. It ran typical for what you would expect. And all night, we were just lining up against other cars and going a couple of years off the stoplights and having fun. So at the same time, there was this fella in the area. We used to call him Dad, right? So now, this guy's really conservative looking. He had like he always used to wear these like button-down shirts, and he had like very neat hair, and he used to wear these thick black-rimmed glasses, and he drove a Pinto station wagon, right? And like it was a wood grain Pinto station wagon, a brown Pinto wood grain wagon, and we're at a light, and Dad pulls up next to us, and he pops the clutch a couple of times, like, you know, let's go. So it's like it's a joke, right? We're going to race Dad. Well, the light turns green, and Dad walks us with this Pinto. Now, it wasn't like he had dropped a 302 or anything in it. It was still a 4-cylinder Pinto. And the motor was essentially stock. The bottom end of it was all stock. It was a 122 cubic inch Pinto motor, which were great engines. It had a cam, it had a header, it had a 4-barrel intake, and it had the biggest Holley carb you ever seen. I don't know what it was. This is a long time ago. It probably a 650 or so double pumper. Maybe a vacuum secondary, I don't know. But it was way bigger than it should have been. And at the time, I'm learning about the formulas and how to choose the right size carburetor and so on and so forth. But all of the examples that I'm seeing in real life contradict these formulas. So Dad's car was one of the examples. And he took me for a ride in that thing later on, and it marched. It had power on top of power, but it shouldn't have run. By the formulas, this thing shouldn't have even started. And I started looking around, and I'm saying, okay, at the time, pro stockers they were running off of cubic inch to weight at the time. So a lot of them were using very small engines, 320, 330, 340 cubic inches. And they were topped with a pair of Dominators. And they were the fastest gasoline carbureted cars in the world. How does this work? And how does a 330-inch engine with 2 Dominators on top of it make so much power when the formula says no? The biggest thing that should have is a 550 CFM carburetor. That's about right as far as the formulas are concerned. And then you look at factory cars. You look at factory examples. So you had the, let's say the 446 pack, which is the same as the 427, 435 Vet. They use the same carburetors, the same tri-power and 6-pack setup, which was 3 Holley 2-barrels, a 350 CFM center and 2 500 outboards. On paper, it's 1,250 CFM. In reality, it actually flows 975 CFM because 2 barrels and 4 barrels are rated differently. But the point being, it's still 975 CFM on a 440 or 427 cubic inch engine. And according to the formulas, well, this thing shouldn't run at all. But nobody ever argued about how much power a 446 pack or a 427 Vet made. And then you look at the 346 pack. Now, nobody ever accused the 346 pack of being overcarbureted. The 346 pack used the same exact carburetors as the 427, 435, and the 446 pack. 975 CFM on 340 cubic inches from the factory. Nobody ever said that's overcarbureted. If you looked at the formulas, if you went by the formulas, well, just tear this stuff up and throw it away because it means nothing. So it was my experience early on that if you want maximum power, you go with much more carburetor than you're supposed to have. So then you have to look at it and you say, well, how do these formulas evolve, and How did the automakers choose the size carburetor that went on their packages? And for that, you have to kind of forget about the way we think of things. So we're hot rodders, we're muscle car guys, we're hot rodders, we're looking for performance. The manufacturers, they wanted performance. Obviously, building a muscle car, it has to perform. But maximum performance, maximum output was not the goal. The criteria they had was that this car, this muscle car, whatever it happened to be, had to function in everyday, real-world traffic scenarios. So, in other words, on a day that has the worst possible atmospheric conditions, and the car loaded down with luggage, and accelerating from a stop up a steep hill, the driver has to be able to just punch this thing and have no bog, no hesitation, no nothing. So now, if you're talking about a mechanical secondary carburetor, like in the muscle car, the vast majority were mechanical secondary carburetors, like these Carter AFBs and the edelbrock, edelbrock today, but Carter AFB back then. So what that means now is that here's closed throttle, right? At 2,000 RPM, let's round it off. Let's say it's a 2,000 RPM stall. So off idle to a 2,000 RPM stall, going up a hill, loaded down in bad weather, the car had to take this and not bog or hesitate or stumble. The driver didn't have to modulate back. The driver didn't have to say, well, my engine will only take 185 CFM at 1,800 RPM, so therefore I only have to go like this. No. These cars, these packages were engineered for non-thinking, non-responsive drivers who don't know any better. They just, I bought a muscle car and I'm going to drive it. So, boof, like that. And this thing has to get up and go. The manufacturers on their muscle car offerings used the largest carburetors they could, given that scenario. And then, if you got lucky, it made a lot of power on the top. The bottom line is, if you take that same 625 CFM 3D3, let's say the 335 horse 3D3, that has a 625 CFM carburetor. If you go to an 850, 900 CFM, 850 CFM carburetor, or you put a six-pack on it, 975 CFM, it will make a lot more than that 375 horsepower. But you're doing it at the sacrifice of what the average person with a loaded down car in, trying to accelerate, merge into traffic or whatever, they flat-foot it, and it has to be able to perform. So that's how the manufacturers, for the most part, chose their carburation. And then, of course, here you get into the factory packages. So you had factory race car packages. Like, here's a perfect example. Factory superstockers and whatnot. Mr. Norm, in 1965, got a load of A990 cars, the factory superstock cross-ram 426 Hemi cars. And the transporter pulled up, and there was like 6 or 8 of these things on the transporter, and not a single one of them would start. So all of the cars had to be rolled off the transporter, rolled into the shop, and they had to pull all the little plugs out and clean the plugs. And it was like a major fiasco getting these cars, to where they were operable. And that's why they were factory race cars. That's why they were super stock package cars, because you weren't able to operate them in regular traffic. And that holds true for pretty much every factory race package. And then you look at other examples, like for instance, dealer install. So if the factory had a package that they wanted to offer for performance, but it didn't meet that criteria of being drivable in everyday traffic by just any old person, they would make it a dealer option. They'd put the parts in the trunk. When you ordered it, they put the parts in the trunk, and then the dealer would install it. So this way it removed them from the liability of a car that didn't function in traffic. So an example of this is the Hyperpack. You go back to the Slant 6, the Hyperpack, the 170 and the 225 cubic inch. Both of those had a 485 CFM 4-barrel carburetor. Those things are miserably sluggish off the get-go, but once they get up in the 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 RPM range, they rock. It was a dealer-installed package. Way over-carbureted. If you take the formula, 170 or 225 cubic inch engine, by those formulas of volumetric efficiency, cubic inch, RPM tells you the CFM it's supposed to be. Well, just take that formula and throw it away. It's meaningless. There's the power. Other examples of that were the Trans Am, the Chevys, the 302. Cross ram. You ordered the car, it came with a single 4-barrel carburetor, but if you ordered it, you could get the cross ram with a pair of 780 CFM Holleys on a cross ram, and the dealer would have to install this. Was 302 cubic, a pair of 780 CFM Holleys on 302 cubic inches? The formulas say, no way, that's not going to work. Those things ran hard, really hard. Actually, AMC had a setup like that also available on the AMX, where it was dealer installed. You order this stuff and it'd come in the trunk, and the dealer would install it. It was a cross ram with the same Holley carburetor setup. I think it was available with the AMX and with the Rambler Scrambler. So this is what I'm saying. The formulas don't work for maximum performance. And if you go by the formulas, you're going to be disappointed. You're going to be disappointed in overall. So now let's talk about now in a multiple carburation setup. I'm leaving a lot of stuff out of this video because there are so many different combinations and packages and so on and so forth that happen over the years, and each have their own specific like idiosyncrasies and qualities that make them very unique. But I have to kind of gloss through those to cover the topic, the bigger topic in general. If there's enough interest, we'll go back and talk about some of the specific packages. But now you're talking about a multiple carburation setup, and we'll go back and let's use our 383 with the tunnel ram. And we're using a pair of vacuum secondary 600 Holleys on it. So you say, oh my God, that's 1200 CFM, and it drowned the motor, there's just no way the thing's going to run, which was the comments over and over again. Oh, there's no way, it's way too much carburetor, put a single 4-barrel on it. A pair of vacuum secondary 600 Holleys means that when you open the throttle, you've only running on the front 2 barrels of the carburetor. The back 2 barrels don't open until the vacuum signal, until there's a strong enough pull through the primary side to open the secondaries. So in other words, when you flat punch this thing with a pair with 2 600 Holleys on it, what you're doing is exactly this with, oh, that's stuck. Oh my God, my secondaries are stuck. All right, here. What did I do? I broke it. Well, actually, this makes me think of something else entirely. Pretend that never happened. It's the same as if I had a 383 and had a single 600 CFM mechanical secondary Carter or Edelbrock carburetor on it. Now, nobody would ever look at a 383 and say, oh, 600 CFM, that's way too much. But a pair of 300 CFM vacuum secondary carburetors gives you exactly the same reaction when you hit the gas. So you have to think. You gotta open your mind a little bit. I do want to talk about the diminishing returns of throttle opening, because, and this doesn't really fit into formulas or sizing or anything, but this is something that like you can pretty much. I wonder why these aren't opening. What the hell's going on with this carburetor? Here we go. It's got the choke lock off on it. So, if you notice, when you're accelerating in your car, throttle opening has a point of diminishing returns. So, if you, from a standstill, from stop, you go to, let's say, quarter throttle, the car jumps, right? It jumps hard, but it doesn't jump far, right? So you'll get an initial hit, but then there isn't quite enough for the RPM. So then you go to half throttle, right? And it's the same thing. The car will hit harder, and that pull will last a little bit further, and then it'll flatten out. Well, then you flat punch it, and it hits pretty much the same as it did the first two, but now it'll run all the way through. It'll accelerate all the way through. You notice that there's no bog difference. You don't have to, if you've got, let's say, an average size carburetor, a 600 CFM carburetor on your 350 cubic inch engine, you don't have to modulate the throttle. You just flat punch it and go. Now, if that carburetor, that 600 CFM carburetor, was too big, and let's talk about now a 700 or an 800 CFM carburetor. If it was too big, you would have to, when you flat punched it, you would actually, it would bog, and then you would have to bring the throttle back. And that would be a good sign that you've gone too big. That would be a good sign that you've gone too far on your carburetor. You have to modulate the throttle back in order for the acceleration to kick. That means that there isn't enough pull through the boosters to get the fuel to come through and atomize correctly, so the motor won't run properly. But if you've got a carburetor, if you've got a setup that you can just flat punch and hold it to the floor and not have to back off to have it accelerate efficiently, you've actually, your carburetor is the right size or too small. You'll know you've gone too far when you put a carburetor on there, and you have to bring the throttle back in order for it to keep pulling. And that goes back to the manufacturers when they chose the carburetors to put on a specific package. Again, they weren't concerned with peak power like we are. They were concerned with drivability for the average, like know-nothing, who's just going to I bought a muscle car, I'm going to drive it in traffic, I'm going to punch it all the time, right? And this thing they're not going to modulate. You know what I'm saying? They're not there to modulate. They're just there to flat punch and the car go. So, how do we pick the right size carburetor? If we're not going by formulas, how do we pick the right size carburetor? That's a tough one, and even the formulas vary for, whether you're doing a street car, regular everyday driver car, in which case size isn't the issue, velocity is the issue, and that's where spread-bore carburetors are so they shine. Spread-bore carburetors have those tiny primaries and huge secondaries. So for your daily driver, you're into the primary side. You got super high velocity through the boosters, good atomization, good throttle response, good economy. You can't beat it. You're not so much worried about the overall size. And there's another thing I want to get into too. So the way the manufacturers sized carburetors. If you go back to the later 70s, the early 80s, General Motors was putting 4-barrel carburetors on things that really never should have had 4-barrel carburetors. Like, for instance, the 301 Pontiac came with a 4-barrel carburetor. A lot of the V6s, a lot of the V6s, turbocharged and not turbocharged, came with the Rochester Quadrajet. And if you look at those cars, those carburetors, and those aren't others, there are many other examples, but if you look at those Rochesters that were the Quadrajets that were fitted to those otherwise tiny, low compression, low flow motors, they all had limited secondaries. So the secondaries were only able to open an eighth of the way, a quarter of the way, a third of the way. It just depended on the combination, how far they would allow the secondaries to open. They were staked so that they couldn't go past that point, because if you went past that point, you would have that situation where if you're in traffic and you've got to accelerate in bad conditions or whatever, you'd have to modulate the throttle. You have to pull the throttle back in order for the car to respond. And they did that at the sacrifice of top-end power. By putting an unstaked Quadrajet on one of those smaller engines, you'd probably pick up a third more horsepower, peak power, but the thing wouldn't function in traffic the way the engineers need it to function in traffic. So again, how do you pick the right size carburetor? All right, so rule of thumb, here's your rules of thumb. If it's basically a stock car, meaning stock cam, exhaust manifolds, regular quiet kind of exhaust, and it's going to be used mostly for cruising, for just, occasional high performance use, but you're really more concerned with drivability and function and fuel mileage and everything else. Go with what the engineers put on there. You're not going to outthink the engineers. If the rest of your package is what the engineers had designed, then go with the size carburetor that the engineers designed into it. Now, if you go in the next step and you talk about moderate performance, so we're talking about you've got a free flow exhaust, you've got headers, you've got maybe a cam, you've got decent heads, you've got an intake manifold. At that point, double your cubic inches to arrive at your CFM. That's the formula that I've always used. I've employed it on, I can't tell you how many cars over the last 45 years. Double the cubic inches, and that will give you the approximate good street and strip performance combination. So and round it up to the next largest size. So 350 Chevy with all of the typical bolt-on performance things will work best for like a 750 Holley or thereabouts, in that range. Mechanical or vacuum secondary, it doesn't really make any difference. we're going to do a whole video on the difference, the main functional differences between vacuum and mechanical secondaries, beyond what's the obvious. The vacuum opens one, linkage opens the other. But not now, because this has already gone way too long. I see people dropping off like flies. Double the cubic inches. Simple, easy formula, and it works almost every time. And if you look at the maximum performance packages, like the 440 street packages, not super stock or factory race packages, but regular production street packages, it actually comes pretty close. 440 cubic inches, double that's 880 cubic inches. You've got the tri-power setup, the 6-pack setup with 950 CFM, 975 CFM. It comes to about right. Double the cubic inches and round up to the next largest carburetor size, and you will be happy. Car will function well in all situations. Now, if you're going past that, and you've got a race cam, you've got race heads, you've got a tuned exhaust, not just a free-flowing exhaust, but a tuned exhaust, you've got all of the elements that make for a race car, well then there is no real formula other than go with the biggest carburetor you can. It's a trial and error, and it can get expensive, trial and error, because like, oh, I'll put an 850 on here, well, let's try a 950, well, let's try a Dominator, well, let's try two Dominator, right? You can keep going with it. But then again, if you're playing the game at that level, you have to expect to spend the money and spend the time. And the bottom line is, go with the biggest carburetor that'll net you the numbers that you're expecting out of your car. You know what it should run. Take your car, the weight, the power, put it through one of the power speed calculators. You know what it should run based on the incrementals that you find on your time slip. Go with the biggest carburetor you can to get as close to what the car should run via those calculators, and that's the right size for you. I know, it's broad, but the bottom line is this. If you go by the formulas, for anything other than a completely stock daily driver car, you will be disappointed. And like I said, don't take my word for this. This isn't my opinion. Go back and actually look at history. Look at the carburetors that the manufacturers put on their maximum performance street packages, and you'll see those formulas have no bearing in the real world. I hope you got something out of that. We're going to do a lot more on this in the future, because this is a topic that I'm really into. But that's it. I'll see you tomorrow.